Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a silence that exists beneath the surface of Warhammer 40,000's greatest stories. Not the silence of empty space, cold and indifferent, and simply the absence of anything at all, but something heavier and more intentional than that. The silence of a secret buried so deep that even the gods who opposed the man who kept it could only speak of it in riddles and half-truths, and the kind of knowing smiles that demon princes wear when they understand something terrible that you do not. This is the silence of Molech. Ask yourself something. In a universe where the god emperor of mankind has sat motionless on a decaying golden machine for 10,000 years, slowly consuming the sacrificed souls of thousands of psychers every single day, just to keep the lights on across 1,000,000 worlds, where wars swallow entire star systems whole, where the worst horrors imaginable crawl out of nightmares and walk openly on the ground of civilized planets, where demons whisper through the cracks in reality and the servants of 4 ancient gods tear apart everything humanity has ever built, generation after generation, without pause. In all of that darkness, in all of that staggering scale of suffering and glory and ruin, what is the one thing the Emperor never wanted anyone to know? Not the existence of chaos. That secret fell apart the moment the word-bearers found their gods and started whispering in their brothers' ears. The moment the legions began choosing sides and the galaxy fractured along lines nobody had thought to draw defenses along. Not the creation of the Primarchs, those 20 godsons scattered across the galaxy like seeds thrown into a storm. That was always going to become known because the Primarchs themselves existed and existed openly and loudly. Not even the true purpose of the Golden Throne and the Imperial Webway project, that vast and failing dream of cutting humanity free from the warp's reach entirely, allowing mankind to travel between stars without touching the domain of the dark gods at all. All of those secrets eventually came to light in one form or another, unwrapped by time and betrayal, and the relentless grinding of the Horus heresy against everything the Imperium had built. No, the one secret the Emperor guarded most carefully, the one truth he erased from the minds of even his beloved Primarch sons, with a surgical precision that bordered on the terrifying in its intimacy and its thoroughness, was a planet. A single, specific, quiet planet sitting close to terror in the darkness of the galaxy. A world called Molech. And what he did there, what he found there, what he took from there, and what he left behind, and the exact shape of the deal he struck inside a portal that led not to another place in real space, but straight into the Imperium itself, into the literal domain of the gods he had sworn his entire existence to opposing. That is the story we are going to move through tonight, slowly and carefully, the way you move through something that deserves every bit of attention you can bring to it. Because Molech is not just another battle of the Horus heresy. It is not simply the backdrop for an impressive fight scene involving towering titans and betraying knights. Molech is the original wound. It is the place where the Emperor, the greatest and most powerful human being who had ever lived or would ever live, the being made from the pooled sacrifice of thousands of psychic shamans, stretching back to the Neolithic dawn of human civilization, the being who had walked secretly through the entire recorded history of our species, guiding and protecting and shaping from the inside out, where that being made a choice, a compromise, a deal that his every instinct should have told him to refuse and walk away from, and understanding that choice, understanding what drove him to it, and what he walked away carrying, and what it ultimately cost him, and everyone he ever cared about, and every human being born in the subsequent 10,000 years of darkness. That is what gives the entire 40,000-year saga of Warhammer 40,000 its deepest and most haunting resonance. Because the Emperor did not stumble into the Horus heresy by accident, he did not fail to anticipate betrayal through mere oversight, or the blindness of a father who trusted too completely. The seeds of the catastrophe were planted in a cave on Molech, long before any of his sons were born, long before the Great Crusade, long before the Imperium existed as anything more than a dream inside a mind that had been dreaming, unbroken, for over 10,000 years. So breathe in. Let the light of the Astronomicon go quiet for just a little while. Because we are going somewhere darker tonight, somewhere older and colder, somewhere that the official histories of the Imperium do not go, and the memorials of the Adeptus Ministorum do not touch. We are going to Molech, and we are going to follow the Emperor through the door he opened there and try to understand, as best we can, given that he never explained it to a single living soul, what he found on the other side, the world before the Emperor. What was Molech? To understand why the Emperor went to Molech in the first place, you first need to understand what Molech actually was. Not what it looked like on the surface, which was ordinary enough, but what it contained, what it had always contained, sitting in the darkness beneath its jungle floor and the bones of its earlier settlers, with the patient waiting quality of something that had always expected to be found eventually. The planet itself was, on the surface, unremarkable. That is the first thing that strikes you when you piece together the available descriptions. Molech was not a world burning with obvious psychic energy that any passerby with warp sense could feel from orbit. It was not covered in ancient ruins left by the Old Ones or the precursors of the Eldar, blazing with the kind of significance that makes explorers from any faction immediately understand they have found something important. On the surface, it was simply a dense, jungle-covered world of roughly similar size and orbital position to Terra, sitting a relatively short distance from humanity's homeworld in the scale of the galaxy, close enough to Terra that its proximity should have made it strategically significant by simple geography, far enough that during the darkest years of the Age of Strife, it had maintained its own independent existence, without constant contact with the homeworld. The comparison to Terra specifically is worth pausing on, because it establishes something about why Molech was settled as early as it was. Early human explorers going out into the galaxy during the dark age of technology were looking for places where humanity could prosper, and a world of similar size and gravity and atmospheric composition to Terra was exactly the kind of find that would draw early colonists. Molech had 4 major continents: Estara, Neuropia, Arcanius, and the largest, Molechari. And much of the planet was given over to thick, close, almost oppressive jungle, the kind that pressed in on settlements the moment human attention turned elsewhere and required constant maintenance to keep from swallowing them entirely. The wildlife was not gentle. Creatures of considerable size and predatory efficiency haunted the deep growth, the kind of fauna that made a simple farming community's daily work into something rather more hazardous than sowing and harvesting should have to be. This necessity drove the development of one of Molech's most defining characteristics: its night houses, night suits, those towering armoured walkers that occupy a space somewhere between a main battle tank and a manned cathedral of war, standing perhaps 12 or more meters tall on their mechanical legs, housing a single pilot in a command throne that interfaces directly with the machine's systems through neural connectors, became not just useful on Molech, but absolutely essential to survival. The earliest colonists who settled the planet needed them not for warfare, but for farming, for land clearance, for the basic act of moving through terrain that would otherwise simply eat them. Over generations, as it happens when a tool becomes indispensable across centuries, the suits became cultural objects, then identity markers, then the entire basis of a social structure. The families who piloted them accrued prestige and land and authority. Those families became noble lineages. Those lineages became night houses. And those night houses became, over the long course of Molech's history before it was reunified with the broader Imperium, the supreme authority on the planet, the closest thing to governance the world possessed. The house that would come to matter most in our story was House Divine. They controlled Molech's primary fortress structure, a great stronghold called the Dawn Citadel, and held authority over most of the planet's significant territory and administrative functions. Their heraldry was a creature native to Molech, a Naga, a rearing serpentine figure depicted in the rampant pose of traditional heraldry. This imagery was not chosen arbitrarily. It reflected something much older than the house itself, reaching back into the religious practices of Molech's earliest inhabitants and their relationship with something they worshipped and feared in equal measure. Before the emperor arrived during the Great Crusade and imposed the imperial truth, the people of Molech and their ruling houses practiced a religion centered on serpentine divine entities they called their gods. The imagery of the serpent was woven into the heraldry and the ceremony and the private devotion of the noble families who had shaped the planet's culture since its earliest settled days. House Divine had built its identity around this symbolism so thoroughly that even after the official adoption of the imperial truth required them to publicly renounce these beliefs, the serpentine tradition did not die. It went underground. It became a secret practice, a serpent cult operating in the spaces the imperial truth's enforcers did not reach, sustained by the same noble families who publicly presented themselves as loyal servants of the emperor and privately continued the rites their ancestors had passed down across generations. But beneath all of this, beneath the feudal politics and the serpent worship, and the vast jungles and the night patrols, and the complex web of alliances and betrayals among the noble houses, beneath even the soil of the planet itself, in a network of caverns carved by forces that no geological process of Molech could account for and no human hand had shaped, something waited. Something that had nothing to do with the planet's native culture or its history or the night houses that ruled it. The Lexicanum states directly that whoever or whatever constructed the cave network and the portal within it is simply not known. It was not built by the people of Molech. It was not the work of the Eldar or the Old Ones or any faction whose fingerprints appear reliably elsewhere in the lore. It was simply there, ancient in a way that predated all of Molech's human history and most of the history of the galaxy's current residents, cold and patient and quietly humming with the energy of the place it opened onto. What made the Molech portal unique among the very rare warp gates scattered across the galaxy was its destination. Most warp gates are transit points. You enter them in one location in real space, and you exit in another, the tunnel between the two passing through the Imperium the way a road passes through a forest. The forest exists around you during the transit, but you are not stopping in it. You are not opening your door and stepping out into it. You are not interacting with what lives inside it. The travel is brief, and the destination is another physical location. The Molech portal was different in a way that made it categorically distinct from almost any other structure of its kind in the known galaxy. It did not connect one point in real space to another. It connected real space directly to the Imperium itself. Step through the Molech gate, and you were not transported anywhere in the physical galaxy. You simply arrived in the warp, in the realm of the gods, in their home territory, where they held every conceivable advantage over anything that had evolved in the physical universe, where the laws of physics were replaced by the laws of emotion and belief and will, where time and space bent according to the desires of entities that had been shaping that environment for longer than humanity had existed. The existence of such a portal, sitting quietly on a modestly important night world a few light years from humanity's home planet, was by any reasonable calculation the most dangerous thing in the Imperium of man. Not because entering it guaranteed destruction for any being who attempted it, though for the vast majority of beings it certainly would, but because of what it represented structurally, a direct, reliable, repeatable path to the highest courts of the Chaos Pantheon. A door in the wall between the material universe and the entities that wanted to consume it. And on the other side of that door, by accounts that would only emerge much later, lay the inner realms of all four Chaos gods, the place where those who were deemed worthy could be elevated to full demonic status, blessed with the combined power of the Pantheon, transformed from powerful beings into vessels for something that transcended the ordinary limits of physical existence. The people of Molech themselves had absolutely no idea what was beneath their feet. Their serpent cults, and their noble rivalries, and their hunts through the deep jungle and their intrigues between night houses and their quiet religious ceremonies in the underground spaces where the imperial truth did not reach, all of it happened in complete ignorance of the fact that their world was, in the most literal possible sense, sitting on top of a gateway to something that would end all of them without a moment's consideration if it ever came through in the other direction. That is what Molech was. A beautiful, savage, politically complicated, essentially ordinary world with the most extraordinary possible thing hidden in its basement, waiting for the one being in the galaxy capable of walking through it and coming back out with what he went in for. The Emperor before Molech, a being built from death before we can understand what drove the Emperor to Molech, and through that portal, we need to sit with who he actually was before that moment. Because the Emperor arriving at a warp gate and choosing to walk through it alone, into the literal domain of the entities most opposed to everything he stood for, is not the behavior of a being acting without enormous, carefully considered purpose. Whatever happened in those caves, it was not impulsive. The Emperor of mankind was many things across his very long existence, but impulsive was never among them. The oldest version of the Emperor's origin story, found in the foundational Warhammer lore of Realm of Chaos, Slaves to Darkness and Realm of Chaos, The Lost and the Damned, the original source text that established the metaphysics of this universe before it grew to its current size, describes something genuinely extraordinary. Long before human civilization had developed writing or cities or agriculture or any of the apparatus we associate with the word civilization, in the prehistory of terror when humanity was still learning what it meant to be human, there existed a group of individuals called the shamans. These were not shamans in the loose cultural sense of spiritual leaders or community wise people, though they were those things as well. They were genuine psychers, true conduits of warp energy, beings born with the ability to sense and touch and draw upon the Imperium in an era when the warp was far younger and far less hostile than it would later become. The relationship between sentient life and the Imperium is not static. The warp is shaped by the emotions and thoughts of the living beings in the physical universe, and in those earliest ages of human civilization, before greed and violence and the complex cruelties of organized society had thoroughly poisoned the deep currents of the Imperium, the warp reflected something closer to the basic needs and simple fears of a species still figuring out how to be. The shamans had a quality that set them completely apart from ordinary humans who lived and died. When they died, they could reincarnate. Their souls would enter the warp, and carrying the accumulated psychic weight of their lived experience, would find their way back into new human bodies and be born again into the world. It was a slow and sometimes difficult process, and it required the warp to be navigable in a way that it would not always remain. But in those early ages, it worked reliably. For millennia upon millennia, these recurring figures carried the wisdom of previous lives into new ones, providing the kind of long-term guidance and deep perspective that ordinary mortal lifespans made impossible for anyone else to accumulate. But then, things began to change. As human civilization grew more complex, as the development of agriculture and surplus and hierarchy and organized warfare entrenched ambition and violence and greed and fear more deeply into the collective human experience, the warp began to darken. The nascent chaos powers, the entities that would eventually mature into Horn, Tziench, Nurgle, and Slayer-Nesh, were growing in the deep currents of the Imperium, fed by the escalating emotional output of billions of humans living increasingly complicated and anguished lives. They grew predatory, they grew attentive, and the shamans found, one by one, and then in increasing numbers, that when they died and their souls entered the warp, something was waiting for them. Something that consumed them before they could reincarnate. The careful, patient lineage of humanity's oldest guides was being picked off at the most vulnerable moment of the cycle, at the transition between death and rebirth, by entities that had recently discovered what an unprotected soul tasted like and found the flavor to their liking. The shamans understood what this meant. Without them, without the slow accumulation of wisdom and psychic guidance that their recurring presences had provided through the long story of human development, humanity would be left entirely exposed to what was growing in the Imperium. The same darkness that was now consuming their souls at death would eventually find other ways into the living world, and humanity would face it without the quiet intermediaries who had always stood between its collective consciousness and the worst of what the warp contained. They gathered. This convergence, by all accounts, took centuries, the last of the shamans coming from across the scattered settlements of prehistoric terror to a single location, bringing with them the weight of their accumulated lives and the full measure of their collective psychic capability. The debate that followed, the discussion of what could be done, is described in the lore as lasting for centuries more, and the answer they arrived at was extraordinary in its terrible logic. They could not survive individually. The warp had grown too dangerous for any single soul to navigate it and return. But perhaps, if they sacrificed themselves all at once, pooling their combined psychic energy into a single act of collective reincarnation, unlike anything that had ever been attempted before, they could forge something new. Not a reborn shaman, not a very powerful shaman, something categorically different, a single being carrying the accumulated psychic power and wisdom of thousands of lives, housed in a body that would never need to reincarnate again, because the sheer force of all those merged souls would render it effectively immortal from birth. And so, in a Neolithic settlement somewhere in what is now the region of central Anatolia in modern Turkey, beside a river, the Sakarya River, according to some accounts, the shamans took poison, all of them. At the same moment, thousands of ancient, powerful psychic souls releasing simultaneously into the warp, too many for the hungry entities that had been picking them off one at a time to swallow all at once. The torrent of released energy overwhelmed predators that had grown comfortable feeding in comfort and at leisure, and 1 year later, a child was born to a perfectly ordinary family of Anatolian herders and farmers. He had no obviously special characteristics at birth. He grew up in a normal home with normal siblings. He had a father he loved, and an uncle who murdered that father, and a childhood lit by grief and by the early bone-deep understanding that the universe was fundamentally unjust, and that this injustice required a response. But this child was the repository of 10,000 years of accumulated shamanic wisdom, carrying in his soul the combined psychic force of thousands of lives that had touched the warp and survived it and grown from it across the entire span of human prehistory. As he grew, he began to remember, not like ordinary memories, not like the ordinary recollection of things experienced in a single life, but like an ocean slowly recognizing itself as the convergence of 1,000 separate rivers. The weight of it was beyond description. The knowledge it contained was beyond any individual's capacity to fully grasp in a single lifetime. And with that knowledge came an awareness of what was coming, not prophecy in the simple sense of seeing the future, but the deep structural understanding of a being who had watched the forces shaping that future accumulate across millennia and could now, for the first time, see them clearly enough to plan against them. He walked through history. This is not metaphor. He literally walked through the recorded and unrecorded history of humanity in the centuries and millennia that followed, taking different names and identities as the ages turned, allowing himself to visibly age when the culture he inhabited expected it, occasionally dying and returning to life in the way his perpetual nature enabled, never staying in any single identity long enough to attract the kind of attention that might have compromised his work. He was present in the rise and fall of empires. He worked through the development of philosophy and science and governance, planting ideas and guiding individuals, and sometimes, when necessary, acting more directly to prevent specific catastrophes that his long perspective could see coming while those living through them could not. Throughout all of this, across all of these thousands of years of patient work, he was building towards something: the Great Crusade, the unified Imperium, the Imperial Webway project. These were not improvised responses to the crises of his era. They were the culmination of a plan that had been developing for longer than most human civilizations had existed, drawing on an understanding of the galaxy's threats and humanity's capabilities that no other being in history had accumulated. But there was one component of that plan that sat beyond his extraordinary capabilities, one piece of the architecture of his great design that remained unavailable to him through either his own power or the technology he had access to. He knew how to build the physical body of a godlike being. The science was available in the dark age of technology, advanced enough to work with the kind of extraordinary genetic template he could provide from his own biology. The Primarch's physical forms, their superhuman size and strength and speed and resilience, their remarkable healing rates and their enhanced cognition, all of that was achievable through the genetic sciences of that era, refined and pushed to their absolute limit. Yes, but achievable. He could clone the bodies. What he could not do, through science alone, was create the Primarchs as they needed to be. A Primarch was not simply a very large and very effective space marine. A Primarch was something that had been touched by the warp at the deepest level of its existence, something whose soul carried a quality that no amount of genetic engineering could replicate through material means alone. The charisma that caused hardened veterans of 100 campaigns to follow Horus into certain death without hesitation. The tactical insight that allowed Reboot Gilliman to reshape a civilization's administrative structure within a single meeting. The beauty that surrounded Sanguinius like a physical force, making men want to be worthy of standing near him. The sheer, unstoppable fury of Angron, terrible and consuming and utterly alien to any normal understanding of human experience. These qualities were not personality traits that could be developed through good upbringing or military training or careful psychological conditioning. They were warp-derived. They came from somewhere beyond the laboratory. The Emperor had the science to build the body. What he lacked was the knowledge of how to infuse a created being's soul with the raw power of the Imperium, how to give his sons the quality that would make them more than supremely capable soldiers, how to make them what they needed to be. That knowledge existed somewhere. He knew it existed, and he knew, with the particular certainty of a being who had been watching the galaxy accumulate its secrets for longer than most people can meaningfully contemplate, where it was. The one-way voyage. The Emperor travels to Molech. The exact date of the Emperor's first visit to Molech is deliberately obscure in the canon, and there is reason to believe this ambiguity is intentional even within the fictional framework. Different sources place it at different points, but the most coherent estimate puts the journey somewhere in the range of the 20th millennium, approximately 10,000 years before the Horus Heresy, 10,000 years before the Great Crusade, a span of time that makes the entire recorded history of the Imperium as we know it look like a brief afternoon in a very long day. He did not travel alone. The lore is clear that he arrived on Molech in the company of several perpetuals, those rare immortal humans whose biological nature sets them completely apart from ordinary humanity. The ability to die and return, to regenerate from any wound no matter how devastating, to survive experiences that would destroy any lesser being and simply carry on. This was the perpetual's defining quality, and it was an expensive thing to maintain. Each resurrection was costly, but it meant that certain individuals had been accumulating lived experience across the same scale of time that the Emperor had been accumulating his, building knowledge and relationships and perspectives through lives that overlapped and intertwined across the long centuries of human history in ways that ordinary mortal experience could never replicate. The most important of these companions for our story was a woman named Olivia Soreka. She is described across multiple Horus Heresy sources as having been alive since at least the late 20th or early 21st century of what we would call the modern era, making her ancient almost beyond reckoning by any human standard, while still being thousands of years younger than the Emperor himself, who had been born in the 8th millennium before the Common Era. She was a potent psyker in her own right, her abilities running particularly toward the empathic. She could sense and to some extent influence the emotional states of those around her. feeling their inner lives as clearly as most people feel temperature or sound. And she was, by all available accounts in the Horus Heresy material, genuinely good in a way that could distinguish itself from the cold, strategic goodness the Emperor sometimes exhibited. She had attachments. She had warmth. She was capable of the kind of caring that required vulnerability, which is a quality the Emperor seems to have viewed from a certain analytical distance, even when he recognized its value in others. The group arrived on Molech aboard a spacecraft. This detail seems unremarkable when you first read it, but it becomes enormously significant when you note what happened afterward. The Emperor and his companions returned to Terra without that ship. They left it on Molech. The Dawn Citadel, the massive fortress that House Divine would later come to control as its primary stronghold, was eventually built around the wreck of the Emperor's original spacecraft, the vessel enshrined within the fortress architecture as a monument and a relic, its true significance lost to the inhabitants who built their power around it. Why leave the ship? Why arrive in a vehicle you apparently have no intention of using for the return journey? The most coherent answer is that the Emperor knew before he arrived how he would be leaving. Either that he would be returning through means that required no conventional transport, teleporting from the surface using his immense psychic power, now fully available to him after what he was about to do, in a way that had not been practical before, or that the departure itself was part of a message he was leaving on the planet, a marker, a monument, something that could be pointed to and explained as the source of a particular legend in Molech's history, without the explanation going anywhere near the actual truth of what the Emperor had come here to do. The descent toward the portal is described across the available accounts in terms that leave no doubt the Emperor knew exactly where he was going and exactly what he would find when he got there. He did not survey Molech systematically, examining its cave systems and geological features the way a scientist might approach an unexplored world. He walked, with purpose and without hesitation, and without stopping to consult anything or anyone, down through the layers of the planet's surface and into the cave network that lay beneath it. And the people with him followed in the particular silence that tends to accompany situations where someone in the group clearly knows something that everyone else is only beginning to understand. What the caves looked like, what the approach to the portal felt like from the perspective of those present, is not described in explicit detail in the available lore, but context can fill in some of the gaps. A direct gateway to the Imperium is not a neutral architectural feature. The warp bleeds through such places, even when they are not actively in use. And the Imperium's nature means that its emotional and psychic qualities are present in whatever space sits adjacent to it. The caves beneath Molech, their walls shaped by whatever force had placed the portal there in the first place, would have felt wrong in the particular way that places close to the warp feel wrong. Not aggressively hostile necessarily, but operating according to rules slightly different from the ones that govern ordinary physical space. The serpent cult of Molech, the indigenous religious practice that had grown up around these caves across centuries of human habitation above them, had likely been drawn to this place not through any formal understanding of what it contained, but through the unconscious sensitivity that long exposure to warp-adjacent locations tends to develop in the people who spend time near them. The Emperor stood at the threshold. Olivia Sarika stood behind him. Whatever was said between them in those final moments before he stepped through is not recorded, but the task he gave her is recorded, because it would define the next several thousand years of her existence. He asked her to remain on Molech as the guardian of the portal, to stay on this world, away from everything else in the human sphere, and make sure that no one else went through that door. Whatever happened in the galaxy beyond Molech, whatever the consequences of what he was about to do inside that portal, the gate needed a keeper who would hold it against anyone who came looking. Think about the weight of that request for a moment. He had not yet gone through. He had not yet obtained what he came for. He had not yet made whatever exchange or committed whatever act of extraordinary psychic theft the portal would require of him. And already, before the first step, he was arranging for the lock on the door behind him. He was designing the security measures for a secret he had not yet created. That kind of planning, laying out the architecture of a cover-up for a choice he was making in the moment, anticipating the knock-on effects and installing countermeasures before the original act was even complete, is the behavior of a being who had been thinking about this journey for a very, very long time and had mapped out every consequence he could reasonably anticipate. She agreed. Of course she agreed. She was one of his oldest companions, and she trusted him in the way that people who have known someone across centuries learn to trust even when the specific request is unclear. And she was still there when the Horus Heresy came, thousands of years later, living quietly with an adopted family in a city near Lupercalia, because perpetuals do not age visibly, and she had long since learned how to inhabit ordinary life without the ordinary timeline. What the Emperor felt as he stood at the threshold of the Molech portal is not something the lore records. The Emperor is not generally a figure who gets moments of recorded vulnerability or introspection, at least not in the sources that survive his long silence. But it is worth sitting with the question anyway. He was the most powerful psychic entity in the galaxy, a being made from the pooled sacrifice of thousands of lives, carrying the full weight of 10,000 years of conscious, purposeful effort toward a specific goal. He had navigated the rise and fall of civilizations without breaking. He had survived the Age of Strife, survived Old Night, survived everything the galaxy had produced in the way of catastrophe. And now he was standing at the edge of a hole in the wall between the material universe and the Imperium, preparing to step through it into the home territory of the four greatest entities in the warp, who had been aware of him as their primary opposition for longer than most of their current worshippers had been alive. He stepped through, and the world above the caves continued its existence in the ordinary way that worlds do, ignorant of what had just happened in the dark beneath them. Crossing the threshold, what the Emperor found inside here is where the lore does something frustrating, and in retrospect completely and deliberately right. It refuses to tell us exactly what happened on the other side of the portal. We receive impressions, we receive the accounts of what the Emperor returned with, and what Horus would later hear from corrupted sources whose motivations for the telling were transparently self-serving. We receive the theories that the authors of the Horus Heresy novel series have embedded in the subtext of the relevant passages without making explicit. We receive philosophical arguments about what must have occurred given the outcome and what we know about the participants, but we do not receive a clean, witness narrative of the Emperor's time inside the Molech portal, the way we receive a clean narrative of, say, the Dropsite Massacre or the Battle of Prospero. The most important negotiation in the history of the Imperium of Man happened in a place where no loyal witness could survive to observe it, between a being who never discussed it afterward and entities for whom truth is a tool rather than a value, something to be deployed when useful and withheld or distorted when not. What we can say with confidence, drawing on multiple corroborating sources across the Horus Heresy novel series and the broader 40,000 canon, is that the Molech portal led directly into the inner realm of chaos itself, not the borderlands or the transitional zones where the Immaterium shades gradually into something more structured, the inner palaces of the chaos powers, the fortresses and courts, where the four great entities of the warp held their full authority, where everything around you was their creation and operated by their rules, where every sensory impression was subject to their interpretation, and every perception of time and space was filtered through their intentions for the being experiencing it. This was their ground in the most absolute possible sense. The warp does not work on neutral physical principles. It reflects emotion and will and psychic force. And in the inner realms of the Chaos Gods, those reflections were entirely dominated by the personalities of the four entities who ruled there. Entering such a place is not like entering a hostile military installation or even a demon world in the outer regions of the Eye of Terror.
Okay, I want to step out the lore for just a second here because I think this is genuinely one of the most underrated corners of the entire Horus Heresy. What gets me about the Molech story isn't the battle. As brutal and tragic as it is, it's what it implies about the Emperor. Because if the trap theory holds up, and honestly, the more I sat down with it while putting this video together, the more I think it does, then the Emperor didn't just went on Terra. He may have been steering the whole thing from the moment he stepped back through that portal 10,000 years ago. And I find that genuinely unsettling in a way that most 40k lore doesn't manage to land for me. Not because the Emperor is cruel, but because the scale of his thinking makes cruelty and kindness kind of meaningless. He thinks in millennia. We're all just pieces on a board we can't even see the edges of. That's what makes this lore so good to me. It doesn't give you a clean answer, it just leaves you sitting with the question. But anyways, let's go back to the video.
It is more like being translated into a completely different mode of existence, one where the rules you rely on to interpret your experience have been replaced by rules written by beings whose goals are fundamentally incompatible with your survival as an independent consciousness. And yet the Emperor went through this environment and came back out. This alone is remarkable. The lore does not suggest he was diminished by the experience or narrowly escaped destruction. He came back purposeful and intact with what he went in for, having navigated an environment that should, by every ordinary calculation, have been utterly overwhelming even to a being of his extraordinary capability. The explanation for this lies in what the Chaos Gods had already learned about him before he walked through that door. They had tried to corrupt or consume or redirect him before, not at Molech, but across the long millennia of his existence in human history, during all those years when he walked under other names and worked his quiet project of preparation. The nascent chaos powers had recognized the anathema, as they would come to call him, from very early in his existence, and they had made their attempts to bring him into their influence, to exploit the same vulnerabilities in him that they exploited so successfully in virtually every other psychically active being in the galaxy. And they had failed, every time, completely. Not through a close shave or through the Emperor exerting himself to resist corruption while barely maintaining his integrity, but through the simple, absolute, constitutional fact that the architecture of his soul was contrary to what the Chaos Gods fed on. The fears and desires and rages and despairs that were their natural entry points into any human being were present in him in some form, necessarily, because he had been built from human souls. But they were present in a configuration that offered no purchase. He was, in the terminology the law uses repeatedly, the anathema, not just resistant to chaos, but its metaphysical opposite, the embodiment of universal order in a universe that the chaos powers needed to remain disordered to survive. You cannot seduce universal order into chaos. It is not a matter of willpower or discipline. It is a matter of fundamental metaphysical nature. So when he walked into the Chaos Gods' domain, they faced a choice that no cosmic intelligence in their position had ever faced before. Negotiate with something they could not corrupt. Exchange with something they could not exploit through the usual channels. The only way to get anything from the anathema was to make a genuine transaction, to offer something of real value in exchange for something they actually wanted to receive from him. Not to trick him into a binding spiritual agreement the way they tricked every other being who treated with them, but to actually deal. This inversion of the normal power dynamic is, I think, the key to understanding everything that followed. The Chaos Gods did not do the Emperor a favor when they shared their knowledge with him. They entered a transaction with someone who fundamentally could not be held to the kinds of spiritual obligations that such transactions normally created, because the corruption and binding that those obligations relied on simply had no mechanism to work on him. They were, in the language of commerce, dealing with a counterparty who was immune to their enforcement mechanisms. They could make the deal, and they could give what they agreed to give, and they could wait for the other side to deliver what he had promised. And when he didn't, when he walked away from Molech with what he had obtained and proceeded to use it against every interest they had, there was nothing they could do to compel compliance. Not directly, not against the anathema. The specific nature of the bargain is described most completely in the account that a demon later gives to Horus after the Battle of Dwell, when Horus is being given the information he needs to understand why Molech is significant and what he might find there for himself. The daemon's account frames the exchange as the Emperor requesting the knowledge needed to imbue created beings with aspects of his own soul, to take the genetic and biological framework of a Primarch and infuse it with warp energy in a way that would give those beings their supernatural qualities. The science of the body he already had, the metaphysics of the soul he did not, and the Chaos Gods, in the territories where everything flows from emotion and will and the raw energies of psychic life, possessed exactly the knowledge of soulcrafting that he needed. What they wanted in return is the part of the law that allows for the most debate. The simplest interpretation, supported by subsequent events, is that they wanted some form of influence over what he created, that the Primarch's susceptibility to chaos corruption, the quality that would eventually lead to the Horus heresy itself, was the price the Emperor paid for the knowledge of how to make them. He accepted that his sons would be touchable by the chaos powers, that their warp-infused souls would carry vulnerabilities that a purely biological creation would not have had, because the alternative was not having the Primarchs at all, and he judged the trade acceptable. A darker reading suggests the bargain was broader, that the Emperor promised, in some form, to allow chaos worship to continue and spread through humanity, to step back from the project of eradicating warp-based religion across his Imperium, and that his subsequent adoption of the imperial truth and his comprehensive campaign against all forms of spiritual practice represented a comprehensive violation of this agreement. This would explain why the Chaos Power's retribution against the Emperor was not simply the opportunistic corrupting of a convenient tool in Horus, but something that felt, from their perspective, more like collecting on a debt that had gone unpaid for too long. The third interpretation, which several of the Horus heresy authors have gestured toward without stating explicitly, is that the Emperor's bargain at Molech was not really a bargain in any meaningful sense. It was an act of extraordinary psychic assertion, the anathema entering the inner realms of the Chaos Gods, and taking what he needed through a combination of negotiation and force of will, allowing them to believe they were getting something from him that he had no intention of delivering, walking out with what he came for, and leaving behind the kind of frustrated, manipulated entity that develops a very particular kind of grudge against the person who tricked it. The demons called it a bargain because from their perspective, they had been cheated, and bargain is the framework they understood for transactions that went wrong. From the Emperor's perspective, it may have been something closer to what Olivia Soreka described it to others. He went in and stole the knowledge from the Chaos Gods. He came out and used it. And the fact that he had to dress the theft in the language of exchange to get it does not mean he ever intended to honor the dressing. Whatever the precise mechanism, he emerged from the Molech portal with what he had come for. And the Chaos Gods, furious and helpless and already beginning to plan how they would eventually make him pay for this, were left holding the remnants of an agreement that had been honored on only one side, the aftermath. What he came back with, he walked back out of the cave, through the passages in the stone, back up toward the surface of Molech, back into the light of a world that seemed, from the outside, exactly as he had left it. Olivia Soreka was there, waiting. The other perpetuals were there. The ship he had arrived on was still sitting on the island of Damask, beginning its long relationship with the climate of the planet. The jungle pressed in from all sides with the particular indifference that jungles have to the momentous events that happen near them. But he was different, not visibly different, not in the way chaos corruption is different, that visible warping and distortion and physical wrongness that clings to those who take too much of the warp into themselves without the constitution to manage it. Different, the way that a scientist is different after finally working through a proof that has resisted them for years. Something had resolved. Something he had needed to understand, he now understood. Something he had needed to possess, he now possessed. He returned to Terra, without the ship, which he left on Molech as planned. A decision that reads now, in retrospect, as one of his more deliberate gestures. The Dawn Citadel that would later be built around it was an implicit monument to the secret he had created on that planet. A physical marker that could be explained in various ways, Without the actual explanation being given, he left Olivia Soreka behind as the portal's guardian, tasking her with an immortal's assignment: watch the gate, ensure it stays closed. Whatever the galaxy throws at you, that portal does not get used by anyone else. And then, he went back to his work. The dark age of technology still had some years to run before the age of strife would tear it all apart. Then came the long nightmare of Old Night. Then came the unification wars on Terra, where the Emperor emerged openly for the first time in a very long time, choosing this moment to begin the final and most direct phase of his plan, rather than continue the quiet background influence he had exercised for millennia. And through all of that, in laboratories carved deep beneath the Himalayan mountains of Terra, in facilities kept secret not just from the wider world, but from virtually everyone in his own organization, he used what he had taken from Molech. He built the Primarchs, 20 extraordinary beings formed from his own genetic material, shaped by sciences that represented the highest capabilities of the dark age of technology pushed to their absolute edge, but infused at the metaphysical level with the warp knowledge he had obtained in those caves on a distant night world. The precise process by which the warp knowledge was applied to the Primarch's creation is not described in explicit technical detail in the lore. It would require understanding the nature of soul crafting that the Chaos Gods possessed, and that the Emperor had, by whatever means, acquired access to. But the results are evident in every account we have of the Primarchs themselves. These were not simply very good, very large, very enhanced space marines. A Primarch was a being whose presence alone altered the quality of everything around it. Horus, before his corruption, could walk into a command conference between Legion officers who had spent years in competitive rivalry with each other, and emerge some hours later having built a coalition that functioned with the coherence of a single organism. Rabut Gilliman could look at a civilization that had been consuming itself in civil conflict for generations and identify, within a single analytical session, the precise reforms that would end the war and produce lasting stability. Sanguinius carried about him something that made people want to be better than they currently were, not through inspiring speeches or deliberate performance, but through what seemed like the simple fact of his existence. Magnus the Red had an intellectual appetite that could have made him the greatest scholar in human history. Had the warp touch in his soul not bent that hunger in directions that the Chaos Gods could eventually exploit? The warp knowledge obtained at Molech was what made these qualities real. The Emperor had built the bodies through science. He had built the souls through what he had taken in that cave. And the souls he had built were magnificent and terrible in equal measure, because the same quality that made a Primarch inspiring to those around him also made him reachable by the forces that the Emperor had bargained with. The warp-infused soul was a brighter candle than a purely biological soul, and the Imperium was drawn to bright candles the way moths are drawn to light. But where moths simply circle and burn, the entities of the warp reach in and begin to reshape. The Chaos powers had anticipated this, or perhaps not anticipated exactly, since we cannot fully reconstruct their intentions from the Emperor's side of the transaction, but understood it. They knew that what they were giving the Emperor would make his creations vulnerable to them. Whether this was a deliberate provision of the bargain, the Emperor explicitly agreeing that his sons could be touched by chaos in exchange for the knowledge of how to make them, or a consequence he accepted as unavoidable because there was no other way to obtain what he needed, the outcome was the same. The Primarchs were extraordinary, and the Primarchs were compromised, and the Chaos Gods understood that the compromised extraordinary beings would eventually be tools through which they could pursue their revenge for the anathema's theft. That revenge came in the form of the warp storm that seized the Primarchs from their gestation chambers deep in the Emperor's Himalayan laboratory while they were still developing. 20 infant demigods, each in their gestation capsule, were caught up in a deliberate eruption of warp energy and hurled outward into the galaxy, scattered across the vast distances between stars to whatever worlds their trajectories ended at, removed from the Emperor's direct care at the moment of their greatest vulnerability, and deposited in environments he had not chosen and could not fully control or predict. He found them again, eventually, over the long course of the Great Crusade. All but two. And what he found was that the environments the scattering had placed them in had shaped them in ways that served his purposes surprisingly well in some cases, and produced dangerous complications in others. The galaxy had been his unintentional collaborator in raising his sons, and some of what it had added to them was genuinely remarkable. But the touch of chaos was in all of them too, to varying degrees and in varying forms, and it would find its outlet eventually. The Chaos Gods were very, very patient, and they had a very long plan. The return to Molech, erasing the past. For a long time after the original visit, Molech sat in its quiet existence at the edge of the human sphere, its night houses governing their territories and hunting their jungles and keeping their serpent religion carefully hidden from imperial observation, the vast majority of the population living in complete ignorance of what was in the caves beneath the planet's surface. Olivia Sarika maintained her vigil, adapting to the rhythms of a world that didn't entirely understand what she was or why she stayed. Eventually settling into something approaching ordinary life, in the way that perpetuals with centuries ahead of them sometimes do, not because they forget their duty, but because the shape of duty sometimes looks, from the outside, like a middle-aged woman living quietly near the capital city. Then came the Great Crusade. The Emperor emerged with his primarchs and his legions, and the project of reunifying the scattered worlds of humanity under a single Imperium of man. Among the thousands of worlds that imperial compliance came to was Molech, and the Emperor did not send a delegation to handle this one. He came himself, not alone. He brought 4 primarchs with him. The Lionel Johnson of the Dark Angels, first among firsts, the Primarch who had been found and shaped by a world of gothic grimness that had made him capable of extraordinary things, and deeply uncomfortable with the kind of open emotional honesty that his brothers sometimes displayed. Jaghatai Khan of the White Scars, the great steppe rider, the commander who fought like weather, everywhere at once, impossible to pin down, devastating in motion. Fulgrim of the Emperor's Children, the Golden Sun, the Lord of the Third Legion who had not yet found his corruption, who was still in that period of his existence where his perfectionism expressed itself as genuine excellence rather than as a descent into Slanesh's embrace. And Horus Lupercal, War Master of the Imperium, the Emperor's most beloved son, the one who walked first among all the brothers, the one whose fall would ultimately cost the galaxy more than any accounting could contain. He brought 4 Primarchs to the planet where his deepest secret was kept, to the world under which the portal sat that connected real space to the inner realm of the very entities he was fighting a civilization-scale war against. This is either one of the most reckless choices in the lore, or it is the exact opposite. The compliance itself was peaceful. The people of Molech had long expected this integration and largely welcomed it. They were human beings who understood at the cultural level that the coming of the Imperium represented stability and connection with the broader human sphere that the Age of Strife had denied them. The serpent cult worship was publicly renounced in favor of the imperial truth. The governing structures were aligned with imperial administration. The night houses were formally recognized under imperial authority and their obligations clarified. Standard compliance procedure executed with the enormous force of presence that 4 Primarchs and portions of their legions naturally represented. Then the Emperor and his sons spent 111 days on Molech. This is the specific number that appears in the accounts. Not 100 days, not several months. 111. A very precise duration for a compliance that, given the military force present and the absence of any meaningful resistance, could theoretically have been completed in a fraction of that time. What was happening during those 111 days? Part of it was certainly the genuine work of compliance, the administrative integration, the establishment of permanent garrison forces, the fortification of the planet's defenses. The city that would become the capital was being constructed or expanded or reorganized. The night houses were being incorporated into the imperial system of obligations and honors. But none of that required 4 Primarchs and portions of their legions for over 3 months. Something else was occupying the Emperor's attention specifically, and that something else, almost certainly, was the caves and what was in them. The city built over the entrance to the cave system was named Lupercalia, named for Horus, the capital of Molech. The city built over the most dangerous secret in the Imperium bore the War Master's name. Whether this was a genuine gesture of affection, a way of marking the location with a significance that would persist in the planet's history without revealing what that significance was, or something calculated in ways that would only become clear much later, is a question the lore leaves deliberately unresolved. The Emperor's motivations at Molech are, like most of his motivations, available to interpretation but not to certainty. When the group left Molech, the Emperor did something that tells you more than any other single act about the level of fear he was managing. He reached into the minds of his 4 sons, and he erased the significance of Molech from their memories. Not the entire experience of the compliance. That would have been too large an absence to go unnoticed. But the quality that made Molech matter, the sense of significance that 4 highly intelligent and psychically active beings would naturally have accumulated across 111 days on a world above a direct gateway to the warp. The specific knowledge of what was in those caves and why they had been there. He removed all of it with a precision that speaks to extraordinary skill and extraordinary motivation combined. And then he removed it from everyone else who had accompanied them. Every Space Marine who had been part of those 4 Legions detachments. Every staff officer and administrator and support personnel who had been present on Molech during the compliance. Every person who had been in proximity to the Emperor during his work in the cave system. He swept the knowledge of Molech's significance from hundreds of minds with a completeness that is, by any measure, one of the most extensive individual acts of psychic editing recorded in the lore. The only people who remembered Molech's significance after the Emperor left were those he had specifically chosen to remember it. Olivia Sarika, who stayed as Guardian, the Emperor himself, possibly Malkador the Sigillite, and a handful of individuals in the absolute innermost circle of the Imperial administration. Everyone else who had been there walked away from Molech with a gap in their memory where its importance should have been, feeling the edge of that gap without being able to identify what was missing. The fear this represents is significant. The Emperor did not fear many things in the ordinary sense, but the prospect of his sons learning what he had done on Molech worried him enough to perform psychic surgery on all 4 of them. It worried him enough to leave an immortal guardian on a distant planet. It worried him enough to construct an entire heavily garrisoned fortress city above the portal to add layers of physical security to the metaphysical ones. He had done something on Molech that he believed his sons would not forgive, or would use against him, or would be damaged by knowing, and he chose to hide it rather than explain it, because the explanation might be the most damaging thing of all. The Molech trap, setting the board for Horus. Now we reach the question that has generated more sustained debate in 40K communities than perhaps any other single lore point. Was Molech a mistake, or was it a plan? Was the Emperor genuinely trying to keep the Molech secret permanently buried, managing the situation as best he could, and ultimately failing when Horus managed to recover his erased memories and launch his assault on the planet? Or was the entire sequence of events, the presence of the 4 Primarchs during the compliance, the imperfect nature of the memory erasure, the failure to fully destroy or permanently seal the portal, the continued existence of the serpent cult on Molech decades after the Imperial truth was supposed to have displaced all religious practice, the specific choice of which 4 Primarchs he brought to the planet? Was all of that deliberate? Was the Emperor, in his incomprehensibly long-term way, laying a trap? The case for the trap interpretation is constructed from the pattern of his apparent failures around Molech. Every precaution he took was taken, but none completely. He erased the Primarch's memories, but left in them a particular sensation, not quite a scar, but something like the feeling of reaching for something in a familiar place and finding nothing there. A gap-shaped absence that Horus in particular would spend years of the heresy puzzling over, unable to identify what had been removed, but unable to stop noticing the shape of the removal. This specific quality of an imperfect erasure, the kind that leaves enough trace to draw attention without providing enough detail to immediately resolve the question, has the character of deliberate design rather than sloppy execution by someone capable of the extraordinary precision the overall erasure demonstrated. He did not seal the portal. This is perhaps the most critical element in the trap argument. The Emperor was the most powerful psychic entity in the galaxy. Olivia Sarika, a perpetual psyker of considerable but not extraordinary power, very nearly sealed the gate herself with a ritual requiring only her own will and concentration. The Emperor, bringing his full capabilities to bear, could have closed that portal with a degree of permanence that would have made it inaccessible to any subsequent user. He chose not to. He chose instead to leave a very well hidden, but ultimately findable functioning gateway to the Chaos Pantheon, sitting accessible beneath the surface of a planet several light years from Terra, guarded by means that were formidable but not absolute. He left the serpent cult intact, the indigenous warp-adjacent religious practice of Molech, the tradition that had grown up around the cave system over centuries of human habitation on the planet, should have been thoroughly dismantled during the 111 days of compliance. The imperial truth was not gentle with competing religious practices. The religious purges that accompanied compliance on other worlds were thorough. On Molech, the serpent cult went underground, continued operating in secret, because the Emperor either did not find it during his time there, did not consider it important enough to fully eradicate, or chose to leave it in place. And the cult, over the subsequent decades and centuries, provided the channel through which House Divine's corruption by Slaanesh would eventually run its course, preparing the planet's most powerful military force to betray the loyalist defenders at the crucial moment. The Bell of Lost Souls analysis of the Molech situation makes the overall structure of the trap argument very clearly. He told the potential rebels, his dark secret, poorly hidden, with a serpent cult allowed to survive, and a portal left functional. Everything pointed toward a moment when a traitor son would learn about Molech and feel compelled to go there. And the Molech portal came with a built-in consequence that the Emperor would have understood before anyone else. What it did to Horus. The power that a being obtains through the Molech portal by submitting to the full attention of the Chaos Pantheon is not the same kind of power the Emperor had obtained. The Emperor had negotiated specifically, had obtained knowledge rather than raw power, had remained constitutionally immune to the corruption that would have normally attended such a transaction. A Primarch going through the same portal, already compromised by chaos, would receive something different. The full, combined, concentrated blessing of all four Chaos gods poured directly into a mortal container that had not been built to permanently sustain it. The raw apotheosis of a champion, the power that made Horus, for a brief period, arguably the most powerful individual in the physical galaxy, and it was killing him the moment it entered him. The Chaos God's fire burns through any vessel that was not designed to hold it indefinitely. Zardu Lyak, the Word-Bearer's sorcerer, who served as one of Horus's closest counselors during the Siege of Terra, stated this as fact. The power would burn Horus out. The War Master had obtained a time limit when he obtained apotheosis, and the pressure of that limit, felt or unfelt, consciously or not, would drive him toward Terra with a speed that overrode every other strategic consideration. He could not consolidate his gains. He could not turn to deal with the Ultramarines advancing from Ultramar, a threat that any rational strategic actor would have addressed before committing to the assault on the throne world. He could not build up his forces further or wait for optimal conditions. He had to drive for Terra now, as fast as possible, because something in him understood at the biological level that now was all he had. By guiding Horus through the Molech portal, whether actively, through the deliberate design of the trap, or passively, through the irresistible lure of the imperfectly hidden secret, the Emperor had handed Horus the most devastating imaginable weapon, and simultaneously made it into the mechanism of his enemy's destruction. The power that made Horus capable of threatening the Golden Throne was the same power that guaranteed he would destroy himself attempting to use it. The trap, if it was a trap, reduced the most complex and terrible conflict in human history to its simplest possible form. One final duel on the bridge of a warship, between a father who had prepared for this moment for millennia and a son who had been burning from the inside, since the moment he walked through a door his father had left open for him. The battle for the gate. Horus walks in his father's footsteps. Horus learned about Molech in the aftermath of a failed assassination attempt at the world of Dwell. White Scar's forces under Jagatai Khan had come closer than comfortable to actually killing the Warmaster in that engagement, and in the tumult of the aftermath something shifted in Horus's memory. A fragment of what the Emperor had removed during the Molech compliance surfaced, incomplete, disorienting, the psychic equivalent of reaching for something in a place you know well, and finding your hand going through empty air where a solid object should be. He called his brothers together. Mortarion was there, the Death Lord, who had passed through his own terrible transformation at Nurgle's hands, and was now something that had once been a Primarch, but was becoming increasingly defined by the Plague God's favour. Fulgrim was there as well, though Fulgrim had passed beyond the threshold of simple corruption into full demonic ascension. He existed now as a demon prince of Slaanesh, the physical body that had been the Emperor's golden sun replaced by something that wore that memory like an elegant disguise over something fundamentally different beneath. Together, they compared the gaps in their memories, the specific shapes of the absences the Emperor had installed in their minds during the Molech compliance. And from those shapes, they began to reconstruct what had been taken. A planet, a cave system, a secret their father had been so determined to hide that he had reached into the minds of his own beloved sons and removed it from them by force. And according to information Horus was simultaneously receiving from other sources, demon-touched intelligence, the kind of revealed knowledge that the Chaos powers deliver to their favoured servants with the particular care of a fisherman arranging bait. That secret involved a warp gate, a direct path to the inner realm of the Chaos gods, the same path the Emperor had walked, the source of the power that had made the Emperor what he was. What Horus felt at this revelation is in the accounts we have, something close to righteous fury, not the simple anger of someone who has been deceived, though that was certainly present, but the more corrosive, more consuming fury of someone whose existing belief in their own betrayal has just been given seemingly ironclad confirmation. The Emperor had done the very thing he had forbidden. He had dealt with chaos. He had obtained power from the ruinous powers, the same powers he had told his sons to oppose and destroy across decades of the Great Crusade. And he had kept that history hidden from them, not through some tactical necessity, but apparently because he knew they would recognize it as the hypocrisy it was. Whether Horus was right about this, whether the Emperor's Molech visit was indeed hypocrisy, or whether it was something else that the Emperor could have explained and defended if he had chosen to, is a question the lore leaves open in exactly the way the most interesting moral questions should be left open. What matters for our story is what Horus believed and what he chose to do with that belief. He chose Molech. He turned the full weight of his military force toward a world that, by any conventional assessment, was not worth the resources required to take it. The Battle of Molech, first introduced in White Dwarf issue number 190 in October of 1995, in an article by Gav Thorpe covering the Slaanesh war machines of the Epic game system, and later expanded with tremendous depth in Graham McNeil's Horus Heresy novel Vengeful Spirit in 2014, was one of the most heavily committed engagements of the Horus Heresy in terms of the sheer weight of forces brought to bear on a single objective. Horus brought the Sons of Horus in force, his own legion at the height of its martial capability. He brought the Death Guard under Mortarion, 58 million defending Imperial troops worth of plague warfare capability. He brought elements of the Emperor's children under the demonic Fulgrim. He brought 4 Titan legions, those walking cathedrals of war that reshuffled the mathematics of any battlefield they entered simply by arriving. Against them, the defenders of Molech had assembled a garrison that would have been more than adequate against almost any force in the galaxy. 3 of their own Titan legions, over 100 regiments of the Imperial army, totaling approximately 58 million troops across PDF divisions and militia and frontline Astra Militarum equivalents, and multiple night houses whose knowledge of Molech's terrain gave them every advantage that ground knowledge can provide. The world was, in short, prepared to be besieged. The Emperor had made very sure of that during those 111 days of compliance. What he had not been able to fully account for was House Divine. The story of House Divine's fall is one of the most effectively rendered betrayal narratives in the Horus Heresy series, because of how long it had been building before the moment of betrayal actually arrived. The serpent cult worship that the Emperor had allegedly banned during the Molech compliance had never truly died. It had gone underground, sustained by members of the divine noble family and their inner circle through decades of quiet, private ceremony and devotion. The warp-adjacent nature of this practice, its deep roots in Slaanesh-flavoured corruption, long before Slaanesh had fully awakened in the warp, had been slowly working on the family's spiritual architecture for generations. Then came the battle. Horus's opening move was to capture Molech's orbital defense platforms and turn them against the Loyalist fleet, using the defenders' own weapons to systematically destroy their naval capacity before any ground operation began. Cities were obliterated by orbital bombardment. The wreckage of destroyed Loyalist ships was redirected into the atmosphere, creating massive impact tsunamis that flooded vast stretches of the coastline and turned previously defensible terrain into chaos. By the time Horus landed, the strategic picture had already been significantly degraded for the defense. Horus himself landed on the island of Damesk, the same island where the Emperor had first set foot on Molech during that original journey. He walked the Fulgurine Path, the route that local tradition identified as the Emperor's original path from the landing site inland. Even now, even in the full depth of his corruption, Horus was capable of this kind of charged symbolism. He was not just attacking a planet, he was completing a pilgrimage, retracing the footsteps of the father he had come to despise and mean to surpass. Fulgrim's role in the battle was not primarily military. His assignment, given by Horus in the planning stages, was to complete the corruption of House Divine that the Serpent cult had been preparing for decades. The Demon Primarch used his Slaanesh-granted abilities to find the cracks in House Divine's already compromised spiritual foundation and apply exactly the right pressure in exactly the right places. The household's internal politics had already been wrecked by a family dispute. The ambitious and ruthless Raven Divine had murdered his own father, the Lord of the House, to seize power, only to die himself in the chaos of the battle's early stages, leaving the household in the hands of his crippled half-brother Albard, who had been imprisoned and tortured by his siblings for years before the battle began, and whose grip on sanity was, by this point, tenuous at best. Albard's visions of the Great Serpent grew overwhelming under Fulgrim's influence. The household turned. The Knights of House Divine, armoured walkers that had been the backbone of Molech's defensive architecture, pivoted and opened fire on the men standing next to them. The Imperator Titan Paragon of Terror, the single most powerful weapon in the Loyalist order of battle, was brought down not by the enemy advance, but by a treacherous combined lance strike from House Divine, attacking from within the defensive lines. The explosion levelled a significant portion of the battlefield and destroyed the coherent structure of the defense simultaneously. Of the 58 million soldiers defending Molech, only approximately 1 in 100 escaped the planet alive on the refugee vessel Molech's Enlightenment, which Horus deliberately allowed to depart so that its survivors could serve as messengers of what had been done here. With the surface battle resolved, Horus moved toward the caves. Olivia Sorica reached the portal ahead of him. She had been managing her extracted family and a small remnant of Ultramarines who had survived the collapse of the defensive lines, moving through the ruins of what had been Lupercalia toward the cave system that was now her primary responsibility. The Ultramarines with her had no detailed understanding of what they were defending, only that this woman who should not have known as much as she clearly knew about the planet's strategic situation was telling them that the thing underground was worth dying for. They believed her, and they threw themselves at the Sons of Horus vanguard in the tunnels, while she descended to the portal itself. She knelt before the gate. She began the ritual, the sustained act of psychic will required to impose a permanent closure on a breach between real space and the Imperium. She was good at this. She had, earlier in the lore, sealed a webway portal faster than the Emperor had managed a similar task, without the benefit of the ancient technology he had used, through sheer personal psychic force and focused intention. She was running out of time, but she was close. Horus arrived while she was still working. The Justarin cleared the last of the Ultramarines. He walked to where she knelt, unable to break her concentration without losing the ritual, and he drove his power talon into her body. She did not die immediately. Perpetuals do not die easily, but the wound was catastrophic enough to shatter her focus, and the ritual collapsed, and the portal remained open. Horus raised Worldbreaker, his great mace, a weapon of ancient and terrifying power, and drove it into the stone stelae around the gate's entrance, demolishing the physical structures that framed it. And he stepped through. From outside, from the perspective of his waiting sons, moments passed. A strange darkness descended in the cave, a pressure that none of them would later be able to accurately describe, a sound that may not have been a sound at all. And then Horus stepped back through. He had aged visibly. The accounts describe him as looking older in a way that Primarchs, who do not age in the ordinary sense, should not look. Inside the Immaterium's inner realm, time had moved differently. He had been inside for what had felt like years from his perspective, winning battles in the Imperium, establishing himself in the courts of the Chaos Gods, forcing the four ruinous powers to acknowledge him as their champion in a way they had previously only been willing to partially commit to. He had faced whatever trials they set before him and prevailed. He had taken what was behind the gate by force of will and personal power, the way his father had taken it by something else entirely, and he had returned. He said he had gotten exactly what he wanted, and even then, in that moment of what he believed was total triumph, the burning had already begun. Legacy, implications, and the unanswered questions. Horus drove for terror after Molech with a speed that left strategic options unaddressed in ways that even his most committed generals found puzzling. The Ultramarines were advancing. Reboot Gilliman was marshalling the armies of Ultramar and the 500 worlds into a relief force that represented a genuine strategic threat to the traitor advance. Any calm reading of the military situation said that this threat needed to be neutralized before committing to the final assault on the throne world. Horus did not neutralize it. He drove for terror anyway, with the urgency of a being who understood, at some level below conscious strategic analysis, that he was running out of time in a way that had nothing to do with the loyalist military situation. The power he had obtained through the Molech portal was extraordinary. At the height of what it made him, standing in the full combined blessing of the Chaos Pantheon, Horus Lupercal was arguably the most powerful individual in the physical galaxy. His presence generated warp storms. His psychic might could reach across the Immaterium and touch the Emperor on the Golden Throne at a distance, weakening the Master of Mankind through sustained psychic siege, in ways that the physical armies battering at the palace walls could not accomplish alone. He was not simply powerful, he was approaching the threshold of something that had previously been reserved for entities that existed primarily in the Immaterium rather than the material world. But Zardu Lyak had been right. The power was burning through him. A mortal form, even a Primarch's extraordinary mortal form, was not built to permanently contain the combined attention of four ancient cosmic entities. The vessel was failing under the weight of what had been poured into it. During the Siege of Terror, Horus spent increasing periods of time in Lupercal's court, the strange pocket dimension that had formed around his flagship, in catatonic states that concerned even his most loyal subordinates. Abaddon, First Captain Ezekiel Abaddon, whose absolute loyalty to the Warmaster had defined him through the entire heresy, began to notice that what his lord had become was not the Horus he had followed, not the brilliant strategic genius who had led the Lunar Wars and then the Sons of Horus through the Great Crusade, but something that ruled through fear and burned with the fire of powers that cared nothing for the human heart of the man they were consuming. The Emperor came to him, aboard the vengeful spirit, in the final confrontation that every event since that original visit to Molech had been building toward, the master of mankind chose an approach that puzzled observers then and continues to puzzle analysts now. He held back. He did not arrive as the full expression of his cosmic power and simply overwhelm what his son had become. He allowed Horus to wound him, grievously, devastatingly, his face burned away, his eye destroyed, his arm torn from its socket, his spine broken over the War Master's knee in a way that left the anathema broken on the floor of the ship that bore his corrupted son's name. He let it happen, and then he did what he had always done on Molech, and in every other impossible situation he had navigated across 10,000 years of patient, long-planned work. He reached past the obvious approach and found the one that actually accomplished what he needed. In the deepest recesses of the soul that had been Horus Lupercal, somewhere beneath the layers of corruption and chaos power, and the accumulated weight of the worst acts any being in the human galaxy had ever committed, he found a fragment that had not yet been consumed. Not Horus, the champion of chaos, not Horus, the War Master who had burned the galaxy, but Horus Lupercal, the first son, the one he had walked beside through the early Great Crusade, with something approaching genuine partnership. Whether this moment of recognition was grief or strategy or both is a question the lore does not fully resolve. But what followed was the single most destructive psychic act the Emperor ever performed in the physical realm, not just killing Horus, but reaching into the warp and unmaking the soul itself, preventing the chaos powers from reconstituting their champion from the Imperium the way they would certainly have attempted if the death had been an ordinary one. He annihilated Horus completely, removing him from the cycle of existence entirely. And in doing so, he spent the last of what he had, the final reserves of his physical capability, and was left broken beyond any possibility of natural recovery. The Golden Throne became his home, his prison, his instrument of continued purpose in the only form left available to him. There he has sat for 10,000 years, slowly dying and slowly burning and slowly sustaining the Astronomicon and holding the Webway gate closed, and doing everything else that the Imperium requires of him, simply because the alternative is unthinkable. The catastrophe of the heresy, the destruction of everything he had spent his existence building toward, had reduced the most extraordinary being in human history to a dying machine sustaining itself by consuming thousands of human lives every day, and all of it traced back to a cave on Molech. Molech itself was liberated during the Great Scouring after the heresy ended, reclaimed from the Death Guard and Emperor's children, who had been left to garrison it after Horus took what he came for. What the planet looked like after the battle, after the tsunamis and the orbital bombardment, and the demon-assisted corruption that had attended the traitor occupation, is not described in satisfying detail. What happened to the portal? Whether Olivia Soreka's partial sealing ritual left it permanently damaged, whether Horus's shattering of the entrance stellae with Worldbreaker affected its fundamental function, whether it remains accessible or has been rendered permanently inert, is a question the current lore has not fully answered. This leaves open a possibility that is worth contemplating. In the era of the Dark Imperium, with the Cicatrix Maledictum tearing the galaxy in two, and the chaos powers more active in the material realm than they have been since the heresy itself, a functioning Molech portal would represent a resource of staggering value to whoever could find and access it. The forces of chaos still exist, and while their memories of the portal date back to the heresy, they have long memories. The forces of the Imperium mostly do not know the portal exists, and the record-keeping catastrophes of 10,000 years of intermittent bureaucratic collapse have not improved that situation. The overlap of these two facts, one side knowing about something powerful that the other side has largely forgotten, is exactly the kind of asymmetric information dynamic that the Horus Heresy series built its best plots around. There are also deeper questions that the Molech story raises that the lore has chosen to leave open rather than resolve, because they are more powerful as questions than they would be as answers. Who built the portal? The Lexicanum states flatly that this is unknown, And there is something uncomfortable about that admission. The Old Ones, the ancient precursors who created the Eldar and fought the war in heaven against the Necrons, are the most frequently proposed architects on the theory that beings capable of creating entire species should certainly have been capable of constructing a reliable passage into the Imperium. The Citan, those star-devouring entities of cold intelligence who fought alongside the Necrons in the war in heaven, are another candidate, though their relationship with the warp is more complicated and the purpose of such a portal in their plans less obvious. Something entirely unaccounted for in the existing lore is the third option, which is perhaps the most interesting because it implies that the galaxy's history contains chapters we have not yet read. The question of what the original bargain actually required of the Emperor is equally unresolved, and equally important to the larger meaning of the Molech story. We know he did not honor whatever he agreed to, because the Chaos Power's fury at his refusal is foundational to the entire Horus Heresy mythos. But what was his side of the exchange? Was it simply an agreement to allow chaos to exist freely alongside the Imperium? A commitment he violated through the Imperial truth and the systematic purging of warp worship? Was it something more specific? The Primarchs themselves, promised as eventual champions for each of the four powers, removed from his possession before they could be delivered? Was it access to the Webway, that ancient Elder transit network that the Emperor was trying to repurpose for humanity's use, which he subsequently barricaded behind the Golden Throne and defended against chaos incursion for 10,000 years? The demon's account to Horus is our primary source for the bargain's terms, and demons construct narratives with the same care that a master manipulator constructs alibis. Selective, technically accurate at key points, shaped to produce a desired emotional response in the listener. What the demon wanted Horus to believe about Molech was that his father was a hypocrite who had done the very thing he had forbidden his sons from doing. Whether that belief was justified, and whether the story the demon told to create that belief was accurate in its particulars, are two different questions. And then there is the question of what Horus experienced inside the portal during the years that passed for him in the warp's inner realm. The Lexicanum account of the Horus Lupercal entry says that inside the warp, he had won 1,000 kingdoms, amassed billions of demonic followers, and defied gods. He had traversed the inner territories of the Chaos Pantheon by force of will and personal power, had established himself as something that could not simply be consumed or corrupted further because there was nothing further to corrupt, had forced the four ruinous powers to acknowledge him as their champion, rather than simply their vessel. The distinction between champion and vessel mattered to Horus. He believed, even then, even at the height of his fall, that he was the one using chaos rather than the one being used by it. The Chaos Gods, for their part, would have understood that belief as the last and most effective form of corruption. The conviction that you are in control when you are most completely not. Molech was the Emperor's move. It was an extraordinary move, planning and patience, and the particular courage of a being willing to walk into a terrible place in order to accomplish something specific and walk back out without looking at what walked back in with them. It was perhaps the best single move anyone has made in a game that has no obvious winner and may never have one. But it was also the move that set the terms for everything that followed, that determined the shape of the betrayal that would come, and the cost that betrayal would extract from a civilization that had never been told what it was built on. In a universe defined by darkness, even the most brilliant champion cannot simply choose their way out of the conditions they operate within. They can maneuver, they can sacrifice, they can endure and plan, and wait for the right moment, with a patience that would break ordinary minds. But the warp is older than human civilization by a margin that makes the entire recorded history of the Imperium look recent. And the entities that live in it have been playing this game since before humanity learned to make fire. Molech was what it was, a world that mattered more than it looked like it mattered. A cave that held a door that led to places no one should go, but that someone did go. Alone and purposeful, and carrying the full weight of 10,000 years of preparation for exactly this moment. A bargain struck in the dark between a being who could not be bound and gods who forgot, just this once to account for what that meant. He found knowledge in the Molech portal. He found power. He found a path to making his vision real, at the cost of his own soul's peace. And somewhere in the transaction, perhaps, he found the first evidence of a truth that the Warhammer 40,000 setting has always quietly insisted upon, that the price of everything real and great is something real and terrible, and that the accounting never balances the way you planned it when you were standing at the threshold deciding whether to step through. He stepped through. He came back. And the galaxy has been paying the interest ever since. If this slow walk through the deepest buried secret in the entire Warhammer 40,000 lore gave you something to sit with, if the weight of Molech lands differently now, if the Emperor's silence on the subject feels more meaningful, if the tragedy of Horus finding that door and walking through it reads with a little more of the inevitable about it, then this is exactly what these videos are made for. Molech does not resolve cleanly. The lore is very careful about that. It gives you enough to understand the shape of what happened without filling in every corner, because some of those corners are more powerful empty than they would be filled. The question of whether the Emperor's original trip was an act of desperate necessity or the first move in a 10,000-year game. The question of whether the bargain he made was a genuine compromise or the most elaborate theft in the history of the galaxy. The question of whether Horus walking through the same portal was a triumph or the moment the trap closed. These remain open, and they should remain open, because the conversation they generate is part of what makes this lore worth returning to. If you are new to this channel, welcome to Q on 40K. This is where we come to sit with the stories that deserve more than a surface reading, the pieces of this universe that reward the kind of attention that most media does not ask for. If you have been here for a while, you know exactly what kind of space this is. Leave a comment with your own reading of what happened in that portal, what you think the Emperor's real intentions were, what you think Molech means for the 10,000-year story that followed it. The best conversations about this lore happen in exactly those kinds of exchanges, and I read every one. The subscribe button and the like are there for the reason they always are. They help more people find the quiet corner of the 40K lore where the deepest conversations happen. If this resonated with you, sharing it with someone who would appreciate it is the purest form of that. The Emperor protects. Even now, even sitting silent on a failing machine with 10,000 years of accumulated damage, seeping through what remains of a body that should have been given peace long ago. Even from a throne he cannot leave. He found something in that portal, and he brought it back, and we are all still living in the consequence of what it cost him to do that. Rest easy.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any, and yeah, sleep well.